My name is Kristen. I am 35, and for the better part of my adult life, I have lived inside a metal tube at an altitude of 10 kilometers, in the thin air between continents, where time loses its meaning and sleep becomes a perpetually scarce currency. I wear a jacket from the most expensive brand in Milan and consult for corporations whose names everyone knows. I enter sterile, polished to a shine conference rooms, and my word, my nod, or my silent dissent, expressed only by a pursing of my lips, can alter the fate of thousands of people and millions of dollars. This is a career I forged myself, at the cost of sleepless nights, at the cost of an emptiness in my personal life, at the cost of silence in that place inside where other people harbor the voices of loved ones. But it brings me an income that smells of expensive perfume and freshly printed banknotes, and a strange, aching satisfaction, as if I had laid my palm upon the hot pulse of the planet itself and could feel the veins of the global economy throbbing beneath my fingers. And there is the country house, my house, that very reward that crowned all my efforts, like a quiet, secluded crown. When I bought it several years ago, I wasn't just acquiring real estate. I was building a fortress. High ceilings that draw the eye upward, wide, floor-to-ceiling windows flooded with sunlight even on an overcast day, and interiors where cold minimalism is softened by the warm, living breath of wood. Every detail here, the sofa you can sink into with a book, the rug that tickles bare feet, the carefully chosen painting on the wall, was a brick in the wall I was building with my own hands, making this place untouchable, sacred, mine alone. For a woman whose life is an endless nomadism between faceless hotel rooms that all smell of someone else and sterility, this house became the only place where I could exhale and simply be Kristen. Not an advisor, not an analyst, not a strategist, just Kristen. And then there is my sister, 3 years younger. For as long as I can remember, we have been like oil and water, like fire and ice. She is an expressive whirlwind, a hurricane of emotions who always, without the slightest hesitation, laid everything she felt out on the table. "I want this," she would declare, and the world around her would immediately adjust. And I bottled everything up inside, every hurt, every joy, every anxiety. I restrained myself, built plans, calculated risks. Her impulsiveness shattered my carefully drawn blueprints for life, and my cold, relentless logic clashed fiercely with her feelings. But it wasn't just a difference in character. No, it was a fundamental dissonance, a discord at the very core of our beings, as if we were tuned to different, incompatible frequencies. When she, still very young, married her longtime boyfriend, a whole new family burst into our already fragile universe. His relatives, his traditions, his world. And our relationship, already strained, became definitively distant, turning into a formality. Holiday dinners on Thanksgiving or Christmas, which we attended by unspoken family statute, were always permeated with the tension of walking on the thinnest ice. We exchanged meaningless phrases about the weather, work, health. We smiled strained smiles. We tried our hardest not to cross the invisible, yet well-known boundaries between us. And this silent truce seemed to us the best possible solution. At least, that's how it was until that day. On that very day, I had just closed a week-long marathon of financial restructuring for a European bank, a complex, draining project that sucked me dry. After a night of final, decisive negotiations, the relief of the client finally nodding and signing the papers was staggering, almost intoxicating. I couldn't wait a minute, not a second. I needed to be home, in my quiet sanctuary. The flight was surprisingly smooth, and by noon I was standing on the familiar narrow path leading to my fortress, lined with seasonal flowers I had once chosen myself at the nursery. Before me was my gorgeous dark wood front door. I was already imagining kicking off these uncomfortable heels, sinking into the soft cushions of my favorite sofa, turning on some mindless streaming show, and just switching off. holding in my chest that small yet so desired, so immense piece of happiness. I inserted the key into the lock, but the very moment the latch clicked and the heavy door swung open, admitting me, all my carefully constructed plans, the sofa, the silence, the peace, shattered into thousands of sharp shards, piercing me straight in the heart. Someone was here, in my house, and not just one person. The air, which had always been filled with the scent of wood wax and fresh coffee, was now heavy, alien. It was cut by a strange, acrid smell, half someone else's daily life, half biting construction dust that tickled the nose and scratched the throat. From behind the ajar living room door, where only the quiet whisper of my space should reign, came unfamiliar, rough male voices, overpowered by the piercing, whining screech of a drill biting into the walls and the dull, methodical blows of a hammer echoing in my temples. Burglars! The thought flashed through my mind like a spark of panic. But no, something didn't add up. The picture was too surreal. By the threshold on the mirror-polished tiles of the hallway that I loved to feel with my bare feet, a careless pile of dirty work boots and worn-out sneakers was scattered, and among that rough leather and rubber I saw them. Neon, acid-bright designer sneakers, the very ones my sister loved to show off in her endless Instagram posts. Something heavy and resonant dropped in my chest, then began to beat with an icy, deathly hammer, spreading cold throughout my body. Holding my breath, I tiptoed down the corridor, muffling the sound of my own heels, and pausing for a moment, placed my palm on the cold chrome handle of the living room. Then, gathering all my will, I swung it open. "What are you doing here?" My voice was quieter and surprisingly calmer than I expected, like a thin glass thread ready to snap at any second. And before me stood my house, and yet it was not my house. At the far end of the living room, where my open-plan kitchen, which I had so carefully chosen after traveling half of Italy and reviewing hundreds of catalogs, should have been, now gaped a monstrous wound. The beautiful tiles were torn away, exposing rough concrete, and pipes hung from the wall like pale, exposed intestines. The main bathroom and toilet had suffered the same fate. Several workers in dust-covered overalls were swinging hammers as if this were not my fortress, but an ordinary construction site, ruthlessly tearing apart the plumbing. Everywhere, on my perfect oak floor, lay fragments of concrete and shreds of once expensive wallpaper. Tools were scattered across my custom-made solid wood kitchen table, smeared with machine oil and gray dust, and in the very center of this chaos, proudly crossing her arms and presiding like a queen upon the ruins of a conquered kingdom, stood my sister. Next to her sat her husband, a good-natured, slightly confused smile frozen on his face, showing not the slightest initiative. A little further away, her relatives, an aunt and uncle, I think, were sprawled on my favorite sofa, casually sipping tea from my own mugs, as if this were their rightful living room. My sudden appearance made everyone freeze. The piercing screech of the drill cut off mid-wail. Silence fell, so thick and complete it seemed time itself had stopped, holding its breath. And the first to break it was my sister's voice, bright, melodious, painfully familiar, and utterly devoid of even a shadow of embarrassment or guilt. "Oh, Kristen, you're back so soon," she exclaimed, her face lighting up with a wide, carefree smile. "Surprise! Look, it's amazing, right? While you were away, we thought we'd redo all your bathrooms and the kitchen for you. Since we're moving in, the old plumbing would be completely impractical, don't you think? You have great taste, of course, but for family life, everything needs to be a bit more functional and sturdy, right?" I didn't immediately grasp the meaning of her words. Moving in, renovation. I knew each of these words perfectly well separately, but linked together in such a monstrous construction, they flew past my consciousness like sounds in an utterly foreign language. Maybe it was jet lag, the consequence of a long flight and fatigue. For a few seconds, I just stood there, dumbly, unable to comprehend, watching the nightmare reality unfolding before me. The gaping holes in the walls, the exposed pipes, the rubble on the floor, and, worst of all, my own relatives effortlessly destroying my sanctuary and behaving as if this place rightfully belonged to them. And from the very depths of my being, from that place where I had stored all my grievances and disappointments for years, anger began to slowly, inexorably rise, thick, searing, like magma. And strangely, I felt it with absolute icy clarity. "Kristen, don't just stand there like a statue. Come sit down." Another voice came from the sofa, an elderly one belonging to the aunt. "You must be very tired from your trip." It was her father-in-law, the one sprawled on my sofa. He spoke in that calm, authoritative tone used by people absolutely confident in their right to command space, considering themselves its full masters. And that single phrase, tossed from the sofa like a whip crack, instantly dispelled the last shreds of my confusion, piercing my brain with an icy, crystal-clear thought. I had opened this door with my own key. The perfectly polished surface showed not a single scratch, not the slightest trace of a break-in. So how did all these people get inside my fortress? I never, hear me, never gave a spare key to anyone. Before we continue this idyllic conversation, my voice cut through the tense air, and I ignored the father-in-law's invitation, fixing my gaze directly on my sister, frozen in the center of the chaos with a speck of paint on her cheek. "Allow me to ask you one simple question. How did you get into my house? I never gave you a key, and the door isn't broken." She froze for a moment, and I saw a quick, lightning-fast spark of panic flash in her eyes. But almost immediately her face broke into that same smug, condescending smile I had hated since childhood. "Oh, the key?" She waved her hand as if it were a trifle. "That Christmas when you had us over, I just borrowed your keychain for a minute while you were distracted and made a copy. Well, you know, you're always on your endless business trips. We never know when you'll be back. Of course, family should have a spare key. Did I really need to ask for permission? We're family. Of course." That word rang in my head not as a justification, but as an alarm bell, deafening and clear. This wasn't her usual impulsive stunt. It was a planned, calculated, cold invasion of my only sanctuary, timed for my long absence. And this realization instantly transformed the boiling anger inside me into something else, a diamond-hard, icy resolve. I slowly turned to the workers who were watching our scene with obvious unease, realizing they were in the epicenter of a family storm. They were blameless, just pawns in this game. "Excuse me." My voice sounded even, devoid of any emotion, clear and businesslike, as during the most difficult negotiations. "Clarify one thing for me. Who exactly hired you for this job?" A guy in a paint-splattered hard hat, apparently the foreman, shifted awkwardly from foot to foot and pointed uncertainly towards my sister. This woman." She said the owner, her sister, was on a long business trip abroad and had entrusted her with the renovations on her behalf. I slowly, almost weightily nodded, feeling every nerve in my body taut as a string. "I see. Thank you for the information. But the owner of this house is me, Kristen, and I never authorized any renovations." I made a tiny pause, letting my next words hang in the air, gaining the weight of an indisputable order. "Whatever contract you were given, I, as the legal owner, order you to immediately cease all work and leave my property. Consider this an official directive. You will be paid for today and compensated for the inconvenience, but right now, I ask you to leave the house." My tone, honed by years of managing multi-million-dollar projects, left no room for discussion. The workers exchanged glances, someone shrugged uncertainly, and then, obeying a silent decision, they began, one by one, to turn off their drills and sanders, which finally fell silent, leaving behind a ringing, tomb-like quiet. "Hey, what are you doing, Kristen? I told them it was fine, so it's fine," my sister shrieked, her voice rising to a high, hysterical pitch. I no longer deigned to answer her personal outbursts. My gaze, cold and heavy, slowly slid over the 4 figures remaining in the room, the intruders. "And as for you," I began, and each word fell like a drop of ice water. "This is not your home. It is mine. And I am asking you for the last time, why are you here? Why are you destroying what is dear to me without my knowledge? Someone, try to explain this to me in normal human words. Why are you so worked up, huh?" The same calm, reproachful voice of the father-in-law sounded again. "Does family mean nothing now? Cut us some slack. Be reasonable." He uttered that word, family, with such an authoritative, indisputable tone, as if it gave him an innate right, despite us not being related by a drop of blood, despite having met at most a couple of times at the holiday table where he silently devoured my turkey. If my real father, the one whose gray hair I remember from childhood, had said these words, something in me might have wavered. Maybe I would have felt bitter sadness or disappointment, but certainly not this instantaneous, physiological rejection rising as a lump in my throat. But this man was a complete stranger. The fact that he had accidentally become related to my sister through his son gave him not the slightest moral right to invade my sanctuary and wield the word family like a club, trying to stun my will. The absurdity and blatant, impenetrable arrogance of this situation brought my cold anger to a boiling point. I looked straight at him, and my voice was quiet but with such steely clarity that every word was imprinted in the sudden silence. "Family? Don't make me laugh." With all my hypothetical respect, I made a tiny sarcastic pause. "You are a complete stranger to me, and here you are, in my house, lecturing me on what is right and wrong. Explain it to me. I don't understand." The father-in-law's face turned purple, filling with blood as if he were about to burst. He looked at me with absolute stunned disbelief, his jaw slack, and when he spoke again, his voice trembled with indignation. "My son's family? They're having financial difficulties. They can't pay the rent, and you're always traveling. On these business trips of yours, the house is huge. So many rooms are empty. I just arranged for them to move in, and the plumbing here is old, completely useless, so we even started renovations out of the goodness of our hearts. Shouldn't family help each other in times of need? You should be grateful, not angry, you foolish girl." Grateful. The moment that word reached my consciousness, the last thinnest thread holding back my fury snapped with a crack. My mouth went dry and bitter. "Grateful," I repeated, and my voice was an icy, burning whisper. You secretly made a copy of my key, broke into my house like thieves, started destroying my property, and you expect me to be grateful. Your idea of normal and mine are 2 different universes. This is not kindness. This is not help. This is blatant trespassing and willful destruction of property. I slowly raised my hand with the phone, and my finger rested on the screen. "You have 1 minute to gather your things and get out of here, or I am dialing the emergency number." I pulled the phone from my coat pocket, and the bright screen illuminated my resolute face. The digits 911 burned against the black background like a sentence. This simple, concrete action instantly transformed their faces. The arrogance that was there a second ago evaporated, replaced by panic. The relatives began to shout, their voices merging into a cacophony of resentment and malice. "Ungrateful! I never thought she could be such a cold egoist." My sister's husband just stood there, powerless and bewildered, like a boy caught in someone else's fight. And my sister looked at me with eyes that held a mixture of utter, bottomless despair and blazing, naked hatred. After watching them leave, muttering curses and insults, I returned to the workers gathered in the hallway and formally terminated their contract. The foreman, who had watched the whole scene, was completely bewildered. I immediately transferred them enough money to cover their day's wages and all inconveniences, promised to formalize the compensation later through their company, and politely but inexorably asked them to leave. I needed these strangers. these witnesses to my humiliation, gone from my space as soon as possible. And so I was left alone. The house sank into its usual powerful, resonant silence, but it was no longer the sanctuary I knew and loved. The torn walls gaping like wounds, the debris scattered everywhere, and the heavy, stagnant atmosphere of alien, hostile presence made it clear that my fortress had fallen. That same day, barely catching my breath after their expulsion, I called a locksmith. I stood over him as he removed the old, betrayed cylinders, feeling with each turn of the screwdriver the noose around my neck loosening. I ordered all the locks in the house replaced with the latest digital models, the ones that open with a fingerprint and a unique code, impossible to pick or secretly copy in a basement workshop. This wasn't just an upgrade, it was an act of surgical separation, cutting the umbilical cord that still connected me to the toxic past. Then, without a second's hesitation, I contacted the largest security company in the country. My voice was firm and emotionless as I ordered everything they had to offer. AI surveillance cameras covering every centimeter of the perimeter, high-sensitivity intrusion sensors on every window and door, and a 24/7 alarm system connected directly to the police dispatch. Simultaneously, I hired another, vetted contractor to patch up the wounds inflicted on my house. Those gaping holes in the walls, those dangling intestine-like pipes. The unexpected huge expenses burned through my bank account, prompting a bitter smirk. But if this was the price for reclaiming my sanctuary and my peace of mind, it seemed the only correct investment. That night, after everyone had left, I sat on the rubble and dust-covered floor of my living room, hugging my knees, the cold parquet seeping through the thin fabric of my trousers. The silence around was resonant, but inside me, voices from childhood were sounding. My sister always wanted what I had, my favorite porcelain doll with blue eyes, my prom dress, my first real friend with whom I whispered at night. And the chorus of our parents played like a broken record. "You're the older sister, Kristen. Give it to her. You're the elder. Just put up with it." And I put up with it. I swallowed the lump of resentment and powerlessness when someone trampled my boundaries with impunity and remained silent, burying the pain deep inside. Now I understood that this monstrous incident with the house was just a logical continuation, the culmination of that ugly pattern. My parents, who had passed away a few years apart, had always taken her side in life. My father melted at her crocodile tears, and my mother constantly repeated her catchphrase, "If you just give in, everything will work itself out." With their passing, that fragile, distorted balance that had somehow held our sisterly relationship together collapsed, and my sister's appetites grew to unimaginable proportions, leaving me with no reason, not the slightest desire, to continue swallowing this injustice. There was no one left to consult, no one to lean on. That's why I had to defend this house alone, with my own hands. But I was no longer that obedient child. I had learned with icy clarity to distinguish what could be discussed from what could never be conceded. And this house, my fortress, was non-negotiable. A few days later, as I more or less expected, they launched a second attack. This time it wasn't a physical invasion, but something more insidious, a calculated campaign to undermine my social standing, to destroy my name. First came calls from distant relatives whose voices I hadn't heard for years. "Kristen, dear, I heard your sister is in trouble." It began with syrupy notes of concern. "They say they have problems with rent, almost out on the street, and you have such a big house just sitting empty. Why not help them, huh? They're your own flesh and blood." It was clear they had concocted a convenient version of events and released it into the wild like a virus. In their story, I was the cruel, heartless career woman who had thrown a poor, suffering family out onto the street, and they were the fragile, innocent victims of my greed. Then came the anonymous calls, silent, breathing into the receiver, both day and deep into the night. On social media, mocking, hint-filled posts from my sister's and her friends' accounts began appearing almost daily, snide remarks designed to sting me. But I no longer gave in. Every time I saw another jab, I switched off all emotions with a click. I took a screenshot, meticulously recorded the date, time, saved direct links, and methodically, like an accountant, filed them away in a specially created folder on my encrypted drive. I named it simply and emotionlessly, Evidence, and I disabled all notifications from their accounts, muted this nagging noise, not allowing their words, like poisoned arrows, to invade my mental space and infect my thoughts with toxic doubts. This didn't mean, however, that I completely severed the channels of communication. I, as a strategist, anticipated that one day they might send a message that would become the final, indisputable proof of their guilt. And I wanted to be ready for that moment, maintaining a cold, detached vigilance. Meanwhile, their calls and messages continued to bombard my phone like a veritable storm. But I refused to answer any, not the angry ones, not the pleading ones. I was no longer the slightest bit interested in hearing their excuses, their twisted logic, or their manipulations. Any, even the most ghostly possibility for dialogue had been irrevocably buried the moment the crowbar in her hands bit into the walls of my home. After I completed the erection of the physical defenses and learned to withstand their psychological attacks, an eerie, unnatural calm settled over my house. Weeks passed in a resonant silence, so deep and unsettling it literally rang in my ears, as if warning of an approaching storm. I didn't believe, couldn't believe, that they had simply given up and retreated. No, they were just biding their time, lurking in the shadows like predators, waiting for the moment when I, tired of constant vigilance, would finally show weakness, relax. I continued to remain vigilant, living in a state of permanent readiness and simultaneously prepared for a new, inevitable business trip abroad. On the morning of my departure, I checked the entire security system 3 times, with manic thoroughness, ensuring every element was working flawlessly. The live video feed from the cameras was clearly transmitting to the app on my phone, creating a living, breathing panorama of my dwelling. The cameras covered every corner, every centimeter, leaving no blind spots, and the motion sensors were set to maximum, almost paranoid sensitivity. And with that light, yet unrelenting feeling of anxiety, with a cold stone in my soul, I left the country again, immersing myself in work. And that day, which fate itself seemed to have been waiting for, arrived exactly 1 week after my departure, deep in the night. It happened right after I, having finished a final review of materials for a crucial presentation the next day in my hotel room, somewhere in the heart of Europe, finally turned off the light and sank exhausted onto the bed. And at the very moment my eyelids began to close, my phone, lying on the nightstand, began to vibrate fiercely, frantically, accompanied by a piercing, ear-splitting alarm signal. It was an emergency alert from my security app of the highest critical level. Warning: unauthorized access detected at garage doors. Warning: motion sensor triggered in backyard. A cold spasm clenched my chest, forcing the air from my lungs as if I had been doused with ice water from head to toe. I jumped out of bed, and my trembling, disobedient fingers began feverishly sliding across the screen, trying to switch the app to the live feed. And there, on that small screen, in a ghostly monochrome infrared image, a full-blown nightmare was unfolding. As I, deep down, had expected, it was them, my sister and her husband, dressed in dark, almost black clothing, like a pair of genuine, professional burglars. They were prowling around my backyard with a flashlight, its beam darting madly. My sister, her face contorted with wild tension, was trying to pry open a window frame with a crowbar, while her husband was yanking and shaking the garage door with fury. The highly sensitive camera microphone picked up and transmitted their whispers with chilling crystal clarity. "She changed all the locks, the cunning bitch," he hissed, shaking the door handle violently. "This window won't budge either," she gritted out, leaning on the crowbar. "She installed new, super strong ones. Damn it! Then we'll just break the glass." His voice sounded decisive and angry. "We just have to be quiet about it." This was no longer a family dispute. With a crowbar in hand, with the intent to break a window, this was deliberate, malicious criminal activity. And at the very moment they, like two shadows, moved towards the large panoramic window of the living room, and my sister, swinging with force, raised the crowbar to strike. My finger, cold and precise, pressed another scarlet button in the app, the icon resembling a drop of blood that activated the alarm. And in the next instant, from my house, tearing the night silence, erupted in deafening, piercing siren wail, and all the floodlights, every single one, flashed on simultaneously, turning the pitch-black backyard into a dazzlingly bright, unnatural field, flooded with light as if in the clearest noon. And in the live feed on my screen, I saw the two intruders freeze in stunned panic, blinded and deafened. Then, dropping the crowbar, scrambled away, scattering in different directions like frightened spiders. And all of it, every gesture, every sound, was captured as irrefutable, crystal clear evidence right on my phone. Taking a deep, measured breath, I, still in my hotel room thousands of kilometers away, with icy calm, dialed the number of the local police precinct serving my neighborhood. Despite the call being international, my voice sounded clear and confident. I explained the situation, described the intruders, and following the dispatcher's instructions, instantly sent the video footage to the provided email address, marveling later at the lightning-fast efficiency with which they acted. A few hours later, as dawn was breaking over London, a short, concise message arrived on my phone from a neighbor. 5 police cars were lined up in front of my house, their lights casting crimson reflections on the walls. And almost immediately, as if by evil intuition, the screen lit up with her name. "Kristen, what's going on? What's with the police?" Her voice was tight, shrill with panic. I answered coldly, measuring every word like a honed blade. "Oh, you don't know? Last night, burglars tried to break into my house. I just informed the police. In these terrible times, it's better to be safe than sorry. You should take care of your own locks, too." Of course, I knew perfectly well that she was the burglar. Her call was nothing more than a desperate, pathetic attempt to deny the harsh reality of the impending arrest. I immediately changed all my business plans and booked the earliest flight home. By the time the plane's wheels touched the runway at the local airport, news had already reached me. My sister and her husband had been arrested on a whole slew of charges: unlawful entry, attempted property damage, and attempted breaking and entering. My phone showed a missed call from Mr. Peterson, that very experienced corporate lawyer I had hired as a preventive measure before leaving, and who, having taken an interest in the case, had taken it on. Despite the leaden fatigue from the flights and jet lag, I went straight from the airport to his office in a prestigious downtown area, where an atmosphere of expensive, weighty silence reigned, smelling of old wood and power. Mr. Peterson, a man with a piercing gaze and an impeccable suit, projected my recording onto a large screen and analyzed it with cold, surgical precision. "This is perfect evidence," he stated, his finger pointing at the frozen frame with the crowbar in my sister's hand. The level of premeditation and the presence of a burglary tool placed this far beyond a simple family squabble. This is a deliberate, aggravated attempted break-in, committed in concert. From a criminal law standpoint, their position is extremely vulnerable. Then he turned his scrutinizing gaze to me. "Kristen, what outcome do you want? Do you want them to receive actual prison sentences, or is your goal to remove them from your life forever?" "The latter," my answer came immediately, without a shadow of a doubt. "I am only interested in complete and final peace. I feel no thirst for revenge or desire to see them behind bars if it can be avoided." On this basis, Mr. Peterson and I built a careful, multi-stage settlement strategy, and, as he predicted, just a few days later, the opposing counsel, pale and tense, approached us with an offer for a pre-trial agreement. The prospect of a criminal record and forever burying the careers of my sister's husband and her father-in-law, who could lose their licenses and jobs, hung over them like a sword of Damocles. Their lives, as they knew them, were effectively coming to an end. And when they finally realized that neither tears, nor threats, nor blackmail worked on me anymore, negotiations remained their only pitiful way out. Mr. Peterson, with slight bewilderment and disgust in his voice, later told me about the outrageous demands they had made during the process. They claimed, he said, slowly shaking his head, that their actions were inevitable because you, quote, failed in your duty as the elder sister to support them. Furthermore, they insisted that you compensate them several $1,000s for so-called renovation expenses they allegedly incurred trying to fix up your house before their illegal move-in. Every legal maneuver they made, every report Mr. Peterson read to me in his even, impassive voice, left me in a state of quiet stupor, shocked to the core by the bottomless, almost instinctive shamelessness of which human self-justification is capable. They seemed to live in a parallel universe where their actions were not only justified, but noble. Mr. Peterson dismantled each of their claims with surgical, almost mechanical calm, using the video, that crystal-clear, irrefutable document, as our primary and invulnerable trump card. Any further unfounded demands, he told the opposing counsel, his voice like ice, will immediately terminate these negotiations. That will mean a full-scale court trial. And if it goes to an open hearing, we will not only present the recording to the court, but also ensure its publication. Whose side do you think public opinion will take? Whose side will the jury be on? After weeks of exhausting wrangling, threats, and empty attempts at blackmail, they finally capitulated. They withdrew all their absurd demands and unconditionally accepted our terms. Through my lawyer, I presented only one, but exhaustive, condition for the settlement. It was not financial. I demanded one thing. From that day until the end of their lives, they were prohibited from making any contact with me personally, approaching my house, my workplace, or any of my property. They were also forbidden from attempting to contact my friends or colleagues, whether in person, by phone, via email, social media, or any other, even yet to be invented means. This condition was to be inscribed in a legally binding agreement, equivalent in force to a lifelong restraining order, and the slightest violation, one call, one message, one appearance in my field of vision, would entail a colossal, ruinous fine. They had no choice. They rushed headlong to sign. On the day of the signing, I sat next to Mr. Peterson in his majestic, dark-paneled conference room. The air was thick and solemn. Word came from the adjacent room where they were. All four, including that very father-in-law, had signed. A few minutes later, through the glass wall of the corridor, I saw them pass by, hunched, heads bowed like the condemned. My sister lingered for a moment, and her hollow, burnt-out gaze met mine. I thought I saw the familiar flame of hatred in her eyes, but now it was dusted with the ash of something else, perhaps shame, or perhaps bitter, belated realization. But my own heart at that moment remained motionless, cold and calm, like the bottom of a deep, bottomless lake. The bond that had once united two sisters who grew up under one roof was torn, erased without a trace, as if it had never existed. Mr. Peterson placed a thick stack of documents with their signatures on the table before me. Congratulations, Kristen. Your freedom is now legally protected. From there, I went straight to the police station and formally withdrew my breaking and entering complaint. The duty officer, a young guy with tired eyes, asked, raising an eyebrow, "Are you absolutely sure about this decision?" I nodded, leaving no room for doubt. My resolve was harder than granite. 6 months have passed since that day. My life has gained that very desired quiet and calm. No anonymous calls, no unexpected visits, no poisonous messages on social media. I could never have imagined how serene existence could be when you no longer have to constantly be on the defensive, always ready for the next ambush. The damaged house was not just repaired, it was reborn, becoming even more beautiful and functional than before. That destroyed kitchen turned into the spacious kitchen island of my dreams, and on weekends I now invite friends over, cook for them in that new, bright space, filling the walls with laughter and light conversation. At work, perhaps strengthened and tempered by this battle, I closed several of the largest contracts of my career. Both professionally and personally, my world gradually regained its bright, vivid colors. I lost my family, or perhaps it was just an illusion of family, a mirage I had created for myself all those years to justify my own compliance. In return, I regained something far more important, my dignity, and the indisputable right to be the sole mistress of my own life. I learned from my own bitter experience that blood ties can sometimes become the strongest and heaviest shackles. Was what I did cruel? Was my action selfish and heartless? Perhaps an outsider might say so, but I feel not a drop of regret, because it wasn't revenge. It was a just and necessary battle for the only thing I truly have, my home and my life.